November 6, 1950 to dawn cold over America. But nothing matched the chill about to descend upon the most unlikely friendship. In American political history, the votes were still being counted when President Harry S. Truman realized he had helped create his own replacement, and the betrayal cut deeper than any military defeat. Dwight David Eisenhower, the General Truman had elevated from obscurity to supreme commander. The man he had practically begged to run for president as a Democrat had just crushed Truman's chosen successor in a Republican landslide. But the real wow wasn't the election loss. It was what Eisenhower had said about Truman during the campaign, words that would echo through the White House halls for months and transform a professional alliance into personal warfare. The relationship between these two men had once seemed unbreakable. Truman, the haberdasher from Missouri, who never attended college, had recognized brilliance in the Kansas farm boy turned soldier. In 1945, when Truman inherited the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt's death, he found himself commanding a global war with generals he barely knew. Eisenhower stood out immediately, not just for his military acumen, but for his political intelligence and diplomatic grace. According to historian David McCullough's account in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Truman, the president saw in Eisenhower a reflection of American possibility, humble origins transformed through merit and service. Truman's faith in Eisenhower bordered on reverence. He promoted him over 366 senior officers to become a 5-star general. He appointed him Chief of Staff of the Army. He made him Supreme Commander of NATO. But more remarkably, in 1951, Truman privately approached Eisenhower with an extraordinary offer. He would step aside and support Eisenhower for president on the Democratic ticket in 1952. Truman believed Eisenhower shared his vision for America internationalist, committed to the New Deal's social protections, supportive of labor unions and civil rights progress. He believed they were kindred spirits separated only by military protocol. Eisenhower declined, claiming he wanted to remain above politics. Truman accepted this with disappointment, but understanding. Then came the betrayal that Truman would never forgive. When Eisenhower finally declared his candidacy in 1952, he ran as a Republican. This alone might have been forgivable. Political parties were less tribal then. But Eisenhower's campaign chose to attack Truman personally, questioning his competence, his integrity, and his handling of the Korean War. The general who had once written Truman letters of profound gratitude now stood on platforms across America suggesting that Truman had been soft on communism, that his administration was riddled with corruption, that he had needlessly sacrificed American boys in Korea. The worst moment came in October 1952 in Wisconsin. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the demagogue who had spent years destroying reputations with reckless accusations of communist sympathies, shared the platform with Eisenhower. McCarthy had particularly targeted George Marshall, the former Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, whom both Truman and Eisenhower revered. Marshall had been Eisenhower's mentor, the man who had plucked him from obscurity and given him command. Eisenhower's speech was supposed to defend Marshall against McCarthy's slanders. But when the moment came, Eisenhower deleted the defense from his speech. The deletion of those paragraphs defending George Catlin Marshall reverberated through Washington like a thunderclap. Truman learned about it while sitting in the Oval Office, reading the early edition of the New York Times on October 9, 1952. The newspaper reported that Eisenhower had stood silently beside McCarthy, the man who had called Marshall a man steeped in falsehood, and suggested he was part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. Eisenhower had said nothing. The general who owed everything to Marshall had chosen political expediency over honor. Truman's hands reportedly shook as he read. According to presidential aide George Elsey's memoirs, Truman threw the newspaper across the room and uttered words that would have blistered paint. Marshall was more than a colleague to Truman. He was the embodiment of American virtue, the architect of victory in World War II and the Marshall Plan that had rebuilt Europe. Truman had defended Marshall ferociously against McCarthy's attacks at great political cost. And now Eisenhower, Marshall's own protege, had remained silent to win McCarthy's endorsement. He betrayed Marshall, Truman told his staff that morning, and if a man will betray his mentor, he'll betray anyone. The campaign grew uglier. Eisenhower's running mate, Richard Nixon, amplified attacks on what Republicans called Truman's mess in Washington. They pointed to minor scandals involving presidential appointees, nothing that touched Truman personally, but enough to paint his administration as corrupt. Eisenhower, who had spent his entire career in the insulated world of the military, seemed genuinely convinced that Truman had mismanaged domestic affairs. He ignored the fact that Truman had guided America through the treacherous early Cold War, contained Soviet expansion in Europe, intervened to save South Korea, desegregated the military, and presided over peacetime prosperity. Truman had already announced he wouldn't seek re-election, instead backing Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, an intellectual who proved too cerebral for the American mood. Voters wanted change after 20 years of Democratic presidents. Eisenhower offered the comforting image of a victorious general who would clean up Washington and end the Korean stalemate. His campaign slogan, "I like Ike," was brilliantly simple. Stevenson's eloquent speeches about nuance and complexity couldn't compete with Eisenhower's promise, "I shall go to Korea." On election night, Eisenhower won in a landslide, 39 states to Stevenson's 9, 442 electoral votes to 89. It was a thorough repudiation of everything Truman had built. The president watched the returns come in from his home in Independence, Missouri, surrounded by friends and family. He maintained his dignity publicly, congratulating Eisenhower and promising a smooth transition. But privately, the hurt festered. The tradition was clear. The outgoing president would host the president-elect at the White House for a cordial meeting to discuss the transfer of power. Truman's staff began preparations for Eisenhower's visit, but Truman nursed his grievances. He remembered Eisenhower's campaign accusations. He remembered the silence in Wisconsin. He remembered letters Eisenhower had written him years earlier, filled with gratitude and respect, and contrasted them with the campaign rhetoric about corruption and incompetence. Then came Eisenhower's mistake, or perhaps his deliberate slight. In late November 1952, Eisenhower fulfilled his campaign promise by flying to Korea. The trip was more photo opportunity than substance. Eisenhower spent 3 days touring the front lines, speaking with commanders and reinforcing his image as the military leader who would personally solve the war. Truman publicly supported the trip, but privately he seethed. According to historian Robert Dalik's account in The Lost Peace, Truman felt Eisenhower was grandstanding, treating the presidency like a military campaign rather than understanding the complex diplomatic negotiations already underway. When Eisenhower returned, his staff contacted the White House to arrange the traditional transition meeting. The date was set, January 7, 1953, less than 2 weeks before the inauguration, but the tone of communications between the two camps remained frosty. Eisenhower's team seemed to expect Truman to treat the general with elaborate deference. January 7, 1953 arrived with freezing rain pelting the White House windows. Inside, Harry Truman prepared for Eisenhower's visit with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his presidency. He had built his reputation on being direct, honest, and prepared, qualities he increasingly felt Eisenhower lacked despite the general's military pedigree. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, allowing time for photographs, a tour, and substantive discussions about national security, particularly the Korean situation and atomic weapons policy. Eisenhower arrived precisely on time, a military habit he never abandoned. But the moment he stepped from his car, tensions crackled. According to White House Chief Usher J.B. West's memoir Upstairs at the White House, Eisenhower initially refused to come inside to greet Truman, instead expecting the President of the United States to come out to the car. This breached all protocol. Truman was still the sitting president. Eisenhower was merely the president-elect. Truman had come out to greet Eisenhower when he returned from Europe in 1945 as a conquering hero, but then Truman had been vice president and Eisenhower the supreme commander who had just won the war. When Truman's staff informed Eisenhower that the president was waiting inside, Eisenhower reluctantly entered. The two men shook hands stiffly for the cameras, their smiles frozen and false. The photographs from that day tell the story. Truman's jaw set firmly, his eyes hard behind his glasses, Eisenhower's famous grin reduced to a tight line, his posture rigid. Neither man looked at the other longer than necessary. They proceeded to the Oval Office with minimal small talk. Truman had prepared extensive briefing books on every critical issue facing the incoming administration: the status of armistice negotiations in Korea, Soviet nuclear capabilities, NATO obligations, the situation in French Indochina, where communist forces threatened to overrun Vietnam, domestic economic policy, and the Byzantine process of preparing the federal budget. He had instructed his top advisors to be available for detailed discussions, but Eisenhower showed little interest in the details. According to Truman's own account, later recorded in his memoirs and confirmed by several staff members present, Eisenhower seemed distracted and dismissive. When Truman tried to explain the complexities of negotiating with the Soviets and Chinese over Korea, Eisenhower interrupted to say he had his own ideas. When Truman offered to have Secretary of State Dean Acheson brief him on delicate diplomatic situations, Eisenhower declined, noting that he would have his own Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who had already been publicly critical of Truman's containment strategy. The breaking point came when Eisenhower raised a personal matter. His wife, Mamie Eisenhower, had visited the White House previously for a traditional tour that the outgoing First Lady, Bess Truman, would give to the incoming First Lady. But Mamie had been offended by something accounts vary on exactly what and had complained to her husband. Some sources suggest Mamie felt Bess Truman had been cold. Others indicate Mamie objected to the lack of staff to greet her. Whatever the cause, Eisenhower mentioned his wife's displeasure to Truman. Truman's response was volcanic. He had endured months of campaign attacks on his character and competence. He had swallowed his fury at Eisenhower's betrayal of Marshall. He had maintained presidential dignity despite feeling personally wounded. But criticizing Bess Truman crossed an uncrossable line. Truman revered his wife, protected her fiercely from public scrutiny, and would not tolerate any slight against her. "If that's the way you feel," Truman reportedly said, his Missouri accent thickening with anger, "there's nothing more to discuss." The meeting ended abruptly. Eisenhower left without the detailed briefings Truman had prepared. The transition that should have taken hours lasted barely 45 minutes. As Eisenhower's car pulled away, Truman stood at the window, watching the man he had made president disappear into the winter rain. Over the following days, Truman's anger hardened into cold resolve. The tradition was that the outgoing president would accompany the incoming president to the Capitol for the inauguration ceremony. Riding together in an open car down Pennsylvania Avenue, it was a powerful symbol of democratic continuity, a peaceful transfer of power. Truman decided he would fulfill that obligation, but barely. January 20th, 1953 marked the end of Harry Truman's presidency, and he intended to make Dwight Eisenhower feel every second of his displeasure. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold, temperature hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Truman rose early in the White House residence, as he had every morning of his presidency, taking his characteristic brisk walk around the grounds. Though on this final morning, security concerns and scheduling limited his route. He dressed carefully in his customary double-breasted suit, adjusted his glasses, and prepared himself for the ordeal of playing nice for the cameras while harboring a fury that would last the rest of his life. According to Margaret Truman's biography of her father, he told Bess that morning, "I'll do my duty to the country, but I'll be damned if I'll pretend to like the man." The presidential limousine was scheduled to collect Eisenhower from his temporary residence at the Statler Hotel at precisely 11 o'clock. Truman would be waiting inside. This itself was unusual. Typically, the outgoing president would greet the incoming president at the White House entrance, but Truman refused to extend that courtesy. He sat in the back seat of the car, staring straight ahead as the driver pulled up to the hotel. Eisenhower emerged and climbed into the limousine. The two men did not shake hands. They did not embrace. They barely acknowledged each other's presence. As the car began its slow progression down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol, surrounded by Secret Service agents and watched by hundreds of thousands of spectators, the two most powerful men in America sat in complete silence. The footage from that day is excruciating to watch. Eisenhower, on the right side of the car, waves and smiles to the crowds, his famous charisma on full display. Truman, on the left, stares straight ahead, his face carved from stone, occasionally offering the barest hint of a wave, but mostly sitting motionless. They do not speak to each other. They do not look at each other. The contrast is stark. The triumphant general basking in adulation, the defeated president maintaining rigid dignity in humiliation. Multiple reporters noted the frozen atmosphere. Time magazine described it as the coldest ride in inaugural history. The New York Herald Tribune observed that the two men might as well have been on different planets. Life magazine published a photograph capturing the moment perfectly, Eisenhower beaming and waving, Truman's profile sharp as a blade, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point. According to several accounts compiled by presidential historian Michael Beschloss, the silence was broken only once. As the limousine passed the Treasury building, Truman mentioned that he had arranged for Eisenhower's son, John Eisenhower, to be granted emergency leave from his army deployment in Korea to attend the inauguration. It was a kindness Truman had extended quietly, using his presidential authority to reunite a family for this important moment. Eisenhower grunted a brief acknowledgement and returned to waving at crowds. That was it, the only exchange between them during the entire ride. They arrived at the Capitol, endured the ceremonial proceedings with professional detachment, and watched as Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office. Eisenhower placed his hand on the Bible's George Washington's Bible from the first inauguration, and Eisenhower's own West Point Bible. He repeated the words that made him the 34th President of the United States. Truman became a private citizen in that instant, released from the burdens he had carried since April 12, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt's death had thrust him into leadership during the final months of World War II. Eisenhower delivered his inaugural address, speaking about peace through strength, the dangers of Soviet communism, and the need for moral clarity in confronting tyranny. Truman sat behind him on the platform, expressionless. When the ceremony concluded, Truman and Best departed immediately for Union Station, where a train waited to carry them home to Independence. There was no final lunch, no extended farewell, none of the gracious gestures that typically mark a transition. Truman wanted nothing more than to escape Washington and leave Eisenhower to manage the office, whose dignity Truman felt he had already compromised. As the train pulled away from Washington, Truman reportedly told his staff, "I'm glad to be going home, and I'm glad that son of a bitch is finally someone else's problem." But the story was far from over. The band formal and explicit was still to come. The first months of Eisenhower's presidency proceeded smoothly enough on the surface. He moved quickly to fulfill his campaign promises, reorganizing the White House staff along military lines, appointing a corporate-friendly cabinet that critics called 8 millionaires and a plumber, and pursuing armistice negotiations in Korea with renewed vigor. By July 27, 1953, he achieved what had eluded Truman, an armistice agreement that ended active fighting in Korea, though it left the country divided at the 38th parallel, exactly where the war had begun 3 years earlier. Truman watched from Independence with mixed feelings. He was genuinely relieved that American soldiers would stop dying in Korea, but he bristled at suggestions that Eisenhower had succeeded where Truman had failed. The truth was more complex. The armistice became possible partly because of Stalin's death in March 1953, which changed Soviet calculations, and partly because Eisenhower's advisors quietly let Chinese and Soviet leaders know that America might use atomic weapons if negotiations stalled a threat Truman had considered but rejected as too dangerous. Eisenhower got credit for ending a war that Truman had fought to contain communist aggression and protect South Korea's independence. From his modest home on North Delaware Street in Independence, Truman settled into the unfamiliar role of former president. There was no presidential pension yet that wouldn't be established until 1958, and Truman survived on his Army pension of $112.50 per month from his World War I service. He supplemented this by writing his memoirs and selling them to Life magazine for $600,000, though after taxes and expenses he netted far less. He refused corporate board positions and lucrative speaking fees, believing it would demean the presidency to cash in on his former office. He did, however, speak freely about Eisenhower, very freely. In interviews, in letters to friends, in his diary entries, Truman unleashed years of accumulated resentment. He called Eisenhower a coward for not defending Marshall. He criticized Eisenhower's lack of political experience and grasp of domestic policy. He suggested that Eisenhower was lazy, relying heavily on staff and cabinet members to make decisions that presidents should make themselves. Most damningly, he questioned Eisenhower's integrity, suggesting the general had been corrupted by his desire to reach the White House. "I made him," Truman wrote in his diary in August 1953. "I pulled him out of obscurity. I made him a 5-star general. I gave him every opportunity a president could give a military man. And this is how he repays me with attacks on my character and disloyalty to the man who taught him everything he knows." These criticisms began appearing in newspapers. Truman gave an interview to Collier's magazine in which he was surprisingly candid about his disappointment in Eisenhower. He didn't quite call the sitting president an ingrate, but the implication was clear. Reporters loved it the feisty former president taking shots at his successor made great copy. Eisenhower, for his part, maintained public silence about Truman. He would not criticize a former president directly, considering it beneath the dignity of the office. But privately, he seethed. He felt Truman's attacks were petty, ungracious, and beneath what a former president should do. In his private diary, Eisenhower wrote in November 1953, "Truman is a small man with a small man's resentments. He cannot accept that the American people rejected his party and his policies. His constant carping does damage to the presidency itself. The tension simmered through 1954 and into 1955. They maintained a frigid distance, communicating only when absolutely necessary through intermediaries. When Eisenhower hosted a White House dinner for Winston Churchill in June 1954, Truman was not invited, a shocking breach of protocol. Churchill, who had worked closely with both men during the war and afterward, noticed the absence and privately expressed his disappointment to aides. Then came the moment that transformed cold relations into an explicit ban. In early 1955, the White House was planning a ceremony to honor George Marshall, who had died in October 1959. The date was meant to commemorate Marshall's contributions to victory in World War II and European recovery through the Marshall Plan. It was to be a significant event with multiple former government officials, military leaders, and diplomats in attendance. Someone on Eisenhower's staff suggested inviting Truman. After all, Truman had appointed Marshall as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Truman had awarded Marshall the Nobel Peace Prize recommendation. Truman and Marshall had worked intimately together during some of America's most challenging years. When the suggestion reached Eisenhower's desk, he wrote a single word across the memo: no. The Marshall ceremony incident revealed the depth of Eisenhower's own bitterness. The president's refusal to invite Truman to honor their mutual friend demonstrated that the wound cut both ways. Eisenhower felt betrayed too, not by any specific action, but by Truman's constant public criticism, his inability to gracefully accept that voters had chosen change, and what Eisenhower perceived as Truman's attempt to undermine his presidency through petty attacks. The formal ban came shortly after the Marshall ceremony dispute, sometime in the spring of 1955. According to Sherman Adams, Eisenhower's chief of staff, who documented this in his memoir First-Hand Report, The Story of the Eisenhower Administration, the president issued clear instructions. Harry Truman was not to be invited to any White House function, ceremony, or event during Eisenhower's tenure. The only exception would be if protocol absolutely demanded it for a state funeral or similar national emergency, and even then, contact would be minimized. The president feels, Adams wrote in a confidential memo to White House staff, that Mr. Truman's continued attacks and his inability to show proper respect for the office he once held make his presence at White House functions inappropriate. This was unprecedented. Former presidents were typically treated with enormous deference and regularly invited to White House events. Herbert Hoover, despite his political differences with Roosevelt and Truman, had been welcomed back for various occasions. But Eisenhower drew a line. Truman was persona non grata. Word of the ban leaked quickly. Washington had no secret, saying it caused considerable controversy. Democrats accused Eisenhower of pettiness and of diminishing the office by holding personal grudges. Republicans defended the decision, pointing to Truman's own behavior and suggesting that he had forfeited the courtesies typically extended to former presidents by continuing to attack his successor so vocally. Truman's response was characteristically defiant. When asked by reporters about being banned from the White House, he laughed and said, "I don't need invitations to that place. I lived there for nearly 8 years. I saw everything there is to see. If Ike doesn't want me around, that's fine with me. I've got plenty to do in independence." But privately, it stung. Margaret Truman later wrote that her father felt the ban was disrespectful not to him personally, but to the office of the presidency itself. Truman believed that former presidents constituted a special fraternity, that only people in America who truly understood the burdens of the office and should maintain collegial relations regardless of party or personal feelings. Franklin Roosevelt had consulted with Herbert Hoover during the war despite their bitter political battles. Truman himself had rehabilitated Hoover's reputation by appointing him to various commissions after years of political exile. The ban held firm through Eisenhower's first term and into his second. From 1955 through 1960, Truman never set foot in the Eisenhower White House. He was not invited to state dinners for foreign leaders, including those like Churchill, whom Truman knew intimately. He was not invited to bill signing ceremonies for significant legislation. He was not consulted on foreign policy matters, even though his experience in handling Soviet relations might have been valuable during crises like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 or the Suez Crisis that same year. There were moments when the ban seemed particularly petty. In December 1957, NATO celebrated its 10th anniversary. Truman had been instrumental in NATO's creation, pushing the groundbreaking alliance through a skeptical Senate in 1949. Eisenhower hosted a White House reception for NATO ambassadors and military commanders. Truman was not invited, even though Eisenhower himself had been NATO's first supreme commander, a position Truman had given him. The silence between them extended to their memoirs. Truman published his two-volume presidential memoirs in 1955 and 1956. Eisenhower read them and found them self-serving and filled with barely disguised criticisms of Eisenhower's campaign and presidency. When Eisenhower began working on his own memoirs years later, he returned the favor, portraying Truman as a well-meaning but limited man who had been overwhelmed by the presidency's demands. Yet for all their mutual resentment, both men faced criticism from within their own parties that gave them an unlikely common ground. Truman watched as liberal Democrats increasingly viewed him as too conservative, to anti-communist, to willing to compromise with Republicans during his presidency. His civil rights record, pioneering for its time, seemed timid to 1950s progressives. His labor policies, once considered pro-union, looked like sellouts to emerging New Left activists. Both men, in other words, were moderate pragmatists being attacked by the ideological extremes of their respective parties. They might have found common cause in defending practical governance against ideological purity, but they never had that conversation. The band might have lasted forever, had history not conspired to force these two stubborn men back together. The catalyst was John Fitzgerald Kennedy's election in 1960. Kennedy, at 43 the youngest elected president in American history, represented a generational shift that put both Truman and Eisenhower in the category of elder statesmen. Suddenly, they were both former presidents, both from an earlier era, both facing a new style of politics that neither fully understood. Kennedy, shrewd and aware of symbolism, decided that he would break the ice between them. He needed both men, Truman for his connection to the Democratic base and party loyalty, Eisenhower for his foreign policy credibility and bipartisan appeal. Kennedy was inheriting a dangerous world. The Cold War was intensifying. Cuba had fallen to Castro's communist revolution in 1959. The Berlin crisis threatened another war in Europe, and nuclear arsenals on both sides grew ever more terrifying. In December 1960, after winning the election but before his inauguration, Kennedy traveled to Palm Desert, California, to meet with Eisenhower for transition briefings. The meeting was cordial and substantive. Eisenhower, despite being a Republican, genuinely wanted the transition to succeed because he loved his country more than his party, something that distinguished him from the partisan warrior he had been during his 1952 campaign. During their conversations, Kennedy asked Eisenhower about Truman. Why had relations between them deteriorated so badly? Eisenhower's answer, according to notes kept by Kennedy aide Theodore Sorensen, was revealing. Harry couldn't accept that the country moved on from him. He took it personally, and he said things about me during the campaign that I could never forgive. Kennedy, ever the politician, saw an opportunity. He asked Eisenhower, if I invited both of you to White House functions, would you come? Eisenhower, after a long pause, said he would, but he would not speak to Truman beyond basic courtesy. Kennedy then flew to Independence to meet with Truman, who offered advice on everything from dealing with Congress to managing the federal bureaucracy. Kennedy broached the subject of the Eisenhower feud. Truman's response was equally stubborn. I betrayed everything I believed in during that campaign. He betrayed his own mentor, George Marshall. I can be in the same room with him, but don't expect me to like it. That's all I need, Kennedy replied, smiling. Just be in the same room. The first test came at Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961. Both Eisenhower and Truman would be present. Eisenhower because he was the outgoing president, Truman because he was an honored guest representing the Democratic Party. Kennedy's staff carefully orchestrated the day to minimize contact between them. They would sit in different sections during the ceremony. They would not be photographed together if possible. They would attend different receptions. But Washington in January is unpredictable. A severe snowstorm hit the city the night before the inauguration, covering everything in 8 inches of snow. The ceremony went forward despite the cold, and in the chaos of managing the weather-related complications, careful planning fell apart. At one point during the pre-inauguration ceremonies, Truman and Eisenhower found themselves standing less than 10 feet apart, both waiting for cars to take them to their designated positions. Photographers captured the moment. Neither man acknowledged the other. Truman looked left. Eisenhower looked right. They might have been on different continents. The photograph ran in newspapers. Across America, with captions noting the continued feud, it became a symbol of how personal animosity could persist even on occasions meant to celebrate Democratic renewal. Kennedy saw it and realized he needed to do more. Over the following months, Kennedy carefully cultivated both men. He invited Truman to White House dinners and sought his advice on dealing with Congress. Truman had been a senator and knew how to manage the legislative branch in ways that Eisenhower never had. He invited Eisenhower to consult on military and foreign policy matters, particularly regarding NATO and European affairs. The breakthrough came in April 1961 during the Bay of Pigs disaster. Kennedy's inherited plan to invade Cuba with CIA-trained Cuban exiles failed catastrophically. Kennedy took full public responsibility, but privately he needed counsel. He called Eisenhower to Camp David for a meeting. Eisenhower, still feeling proprietary about foreign policy, came immediately. Their conversation was frank. Eisenhower pointed out the planning flaws that had doomed the invasion. Kennedy absorbed the criticism without defensiveness. Then Kennedy did something surprising. He asked if Eisenhower thought Truman's advice would be valuable regarding how to manage Congress and public opinion after such a failure. Eisenhower considered Kennedy's question about Truman carefully. The young president was offering him something subtle, a chance to move past the feud without admitting fault, wrapped in the language of national service. After a long moment, Eisenhower said, "Harry knows how to take a punch and keep standing. God knows he took enough of them. If you can get him to help you, do it." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was permission. Kennedy invited Truman to the White House in May 1961. The former president accepted immediately. He couldn't resist being back in the center of action, and he appreciated Kennedy's respectful approach. During that visit, Kennedy casually mentioned that he had consulted with Eisenhower about the Bay of Pigs aftermath. Truman's reaction was measured. "Ike knows military failures," Truman said, not entirely kindly. "He made enough of them before he got famous." But he didn't launch into a tirade, which Kennedy took as progress. Over the next year, Kennedy orchestrated several events where both men would be present, always with careful staging to avoid forced interaction. The breakthrough came on May 8, 1962. When Kennedy invited both Truman and Eisenhower to a White House dinner, honoring Nobel Prize winners from the Western Hemisphere. It was a glittering occasion. The brightest minds in science, literature, and peace advocacy gathered in the state dining room. Kennedy's strategy was clever. In such elevated company, focusing on human achievement and knowledge, personal feuds seemed petty. Both Truman and Eisenhower prided themselves on being bigger than their egos, even though their feuds suggested otherwise. Surrounded by Nobel laureates including Linus Pauling, who had won prizes in both chemistry and peace, petty grievances felt inappropriate. Kennedy seated them at different tables but in the same room. After dinner, during the reception, Kennedy personally walked Truman over to where Eisenhower was standing with a group of scientists. "Mr. President," Kennedy said, addressing both men with the title they shared, "I wanted you to meet Dr. Pauling's work on the dangers of nuclear testing. I thought you both might have perspectives on how we balance national security with the concerns he's raising."